Eastern Colorado, July 11, 1869. At the head of a small ravine situated on the open, rolling plains, a young Cheyenne warrior named Wolf with Plenty of Hair stands defiantly, ready to receive the oncoming charge of U.S. Army scouts and soldiers coming at him. With his eyes fixed sternly on the charging Americans, he lets loose a blue sash that is tied to his waist. The sash falls to the dirt, and he drives a long, crooked lance through it, tethering himself to the ground. He is a member of the Cheyenne warrior society known as the Dog Soldiers, and this is his signal to the enemy that he is ready to fight to the death. His leader, a legendary Cheyenne chief named Tall Bull, stands not far away, himself making ready to defend his wife and sister. They have been ambushed by these soldiers and driven from their village. Where only minutes before most of the Cheyenne had been enjoying their midday meal, their village is now a veritable house of horrors, with dead and dying warriors strewn about the ground and terrified women and children being taken prisoner by the army. Tall Bull has ordered the survivors into this ravine, where he and his warriors plan to fight to the last man in order to protect their families. On the American side, Major General Eugene Carr leads a contingent of U.S. Army soldiers and scouts, including a young William Buffalo Bill Cody, as all of them race towards the ravine. Within a matter of moments, their attack smashes into the Cheyenne line, and young Wolf with Plenty of Hair prepares to make his last stand. Dust and screams now fill the air as every soldier and scout seeks to engage and to kill any Cheyenne warrior that they can. This scene is one of utter chaos and carnage, with vicious hand-to-hand fighting unfolding within the cramped confines of the ravine. Warrior after warrior falls as they fight to the death, with many of their wives and children only a few yards away. But this ambush, though brutal, is by no means random. It is the result of a war that has been escalating for many years between the encroaching American settlers of Colorado and the Cheyenne. In the previous 5 years, the Cheyenne, incensed at the events of 1864's Sand Creek Massacre, in which a large village of Cheyenne, presumably on peaceable terms with the United States, had been ambushed by U.S. Army troops under the command of Colonel John Chivington. Men, women, and children alike had been callously cut down in what would come to be known as one of the darkest chapters in the entire history of the Old West. This event had led to the last 5 years being among the bloodiest in Colorado history, as the Cheyenne have sought their vengeance against any of those they see as responsible for the massacre. For any American seeking to settle on its expansive prairies, eastern Colorado has proven to be a very dangerous place. But the events of the prior few weeks have proven uniquely violent even by the standards of the Colorado frontier. It had begun on Sunday, May 30th, at the home of Michael Haley, located about a quarter-mile north of the Saline River. Here, 19-year-old Eli Ziegler and his brother-in-law, John Alverson, had stopped on their journey to visit a nearby homestead so that they could visit Eli's sister, Susanna Alderdice, and her 4 young children. Susanna's husband, Thomas, had been away on business and had left his young family to stay in the cabin while he was gone. Michael Haley, the owner of the cabin, had taken his family to nearby Fort Harker, believing that Cheyenne raids upon this settlement were imminent. Also staying at the Haley home was Bridget Kine and her 2-month-old daughter, Catherine. Mrs. Kine's husband had also been away on the same business trip and left his young family here in case the Cheyenne should attack. As Eli and John Alverson had finished visiting, Eli bade his sister and young nieces and nephews farewell, before he and Alverson had loaded up into the buckboard wagon and headed off to survey the homestead site. The young men had followed Spillman Creek to nearby Lost Creek, and then had made their way north until hitting the crossing site at Trail Creek. It was here that Eli Ziegler had first noticed a group of a few dozen horsemen several hundred yards away. He had pointed them out to Alverson, noting that he believed them to be a group of U.S. Army cavalrymen, but Alverson had staunchly disagreed, believing them instead to be a group of Cheyenne. In his later account, Zeigler would recall that, quote, "The sun glistened on their guns so plain that I still thought that they were soldiers, but John would not have it that way, and I had about made up my mind that they were," end quote. They had continued on arguing and becoming increasingly nervous. Then, they saw the group split into two, with half of the group suddenly riding away. The group who had remained then charged directly towards Alderdice and Zeigler. Now, it was readily apparent to both of them that this group was in fact Cheyenne. And as the Cheyenne approached, they knew it was too late to try to escape. Still, Zeigler had quickly turned the wagon around and made a desperate bid to outrun the oncoming warriors. His account of the attack continues. Quote, "We got to the creek. The Indians were close behind us. I looked across the creek and thought there was a little bank on the other side that would protect us some. So I drove across, but John misunderstood me and jumped into the creek as I drove up the bank. John ran along the bank under the side that I was on as the Indians were coming across the creek within a few yards of us, shooting and yelling. John was calling for me to get out of the wagon. When I got to that little bank, I stopped the horses. Seeing that nothing more could be done to save the team, and that we must defend ourselves, I dropped the lines, grabbed my gun, and jumped out on the off side of the wagon. Reaching into the wagon for my cartridges, I could only get one box, containing about 20 rounds. While I was getting the cartridges, the Indians were closing in all around. One of them rode up and picked up the lines that I had just laid down, and he held the horses. The Indians were shooting this entire time. John was calling for me to get under the bank. Just then, an Indian darted right up close to the wagon, and I thought that I would let him have it. But before I could cover him with my gun, he jumped off his pony and onto the opposite side of the wagon. John was still begging for me to jump over the bank, and I had made up my mind to. But as I stepped out of the wagon, I looked toward the rear and behind the wagon, and I saw 3 Indians standing about 4 rods away, having me covered with their guns. I had no time for a shot, so I made a spring for the creek bank, but I slipped and fell just as they fired. I think they shot over me. I kept going on my hands and knees over to the bank, and then we saw a log, and we ran to that, thinking that it might protect us. Here, the 2 men had managed to hide until late afternoon. Meanwhile, the Cheyenne had left, heading to meet the other half of their war party who had headed north. This second half of their group was a band of dog soldiers under the leadership of the legendary Tall Bull. They had followed Spillman Creek, where they had first encountered a local Danish immigrant couple named Erskine and Stein Lauritsen. The couple had been out for a peaceful Sunday stroll along the creek when Tall Bull and his dog soldiers had suddenly appeared. The unfortunate couple was cut down within minutes, their bodies left lying near the creek where they had fallen. At around 2 p.m., they had then attacked George and Maria Weichel, as well as their neighbor Fred Meigerhoff, all 3 of whom were also out on a Sunday stroll along the creek. The 2 men in George Weichel and Fred Meigerhoff had been armed, and both had put up a vicious fight against the Cheyenne, firing and reloading while covering for the escape of Maria Weichel. In a 3-mile running fight, the trio managed to make their way down to Spillman Creek, heading southeast. Finally, though, the 2 men had run out of ammunition, and in what must have been a horrific scene, they were both cut down by Tall Bull and his men. Then, Maria Weichel had been swiftly lifted onto the back of a dog soldier's horse, after which the warriors rode away from the site of the killings. However, Weichel's ordeal had only begun. A few yards away, the dog soldiers stopped in order to practice their long-held ritual of Noha Wastan, or staking to the prairie, in which the unfortunate victim was repeatedly assaulted via all manner of violations. Not far from here, the group of Cheyenne warriors who had first attacked Eli Zeigler and John Alderdice now struck the home of Michael Haley. At first sight of the approaching warriors, the children were gathered inside the Haley home, as the warriors first focused their attention on the corrals, taking custody of all of the horses that they could. Believing that they were trapped in the house with no hope of escape, Susanna Alderdice had taken her 4 children, with her youngest in her arms, and made a break for the Saline River. Bridget Kine had quickly followed suit, grabbing her daughter and running for the banks of the river. And, in a terrifying, painstaking effort, the two pregnant women had ushered their young children towards the water. It had, in fact, seemed to both women that they might actually be able to make it to the river undetected by the Cheyenne, but just as they neared the banks, they were spotted. Bridget Kine, still clutching her infant child to her chest, had plunged over the steep banks of the river and managed to hide under an overhang, praying that her child did not cry out. Susanna Alderdice and her children, however, would not be so fortunate. Moments after being spotted, the Cheyenne had charged towards her and her children. Seeing that they were surrounded, Susanna had fallen to the ground, protecting her 8-month-old as best she could, but her remaining 3 sons were all summarily struck down by Cheyenne arrows. The horrified young mother, having just witnessed all but one of her children fall victim to the Cheyenne, was then scooped up and tied to the back of a horse, still clutching her youngest child. As this terrifying scene unfolded, a pair of younger Cheyenne, one of them a mere teenager, had split off from the 2 main groups, looking to find their own opportunities for looting and glory. They happened upon 2 local teenaged boys named Arthur Schmutz and John Strange, who were spending their afternoon harvesting turnips. In an unnerving scene, the 2 Cheyenne had approached the boys under overtures of peace, stating that they were friendly Pawnee scouts. Unsure of exactly what was happening, Schmutz and Strange had remained affable, even allowing the older Cheyenne to touch them on the shoulders with his spear in what they believed to be a sign of peace. But immediately after this, the teenage Cheyenne had ridden up to John Strange and suddenly pulled his war club, then bashed it into the unfortunate Strange's head with such force that the handle broke. Strange had managed to cry out, "Oh Lord!" before collapsing dead. Stunned at what he had just witnessed, Schmutz was momentarily frozen. In this moment, the teenage Cheyenne had drawn his bow and quickly loosed an arrow that hit Schmutz in the chest. However, the wound was not mortal, and Schmutz had then bolted into a full sprint and attempted to outrun his attackers. The young Cheyenne warrior then fired another arrow, this one striking Schmutz in the back. But still, he ran on. Schmutz, with arrows protruding from his torso, sprinted all the way to Strange's family homestead, crying out that the Cheyenne were attacking. Hearing this, the younger brothers of the slain John Strange, Riley and Marion Strange, grabbed their guns and ran to his aid, providing covering fire as Schmutz reached their cabin. The Cheyenne had abandoned their chase as the injured boy collapsed inside the cabin, first attempting to drive off the Strange family horses before finally disappearing into the open landscape. The family had then huddled inside their cabin, attempting to care for Arthur Schmutz, who had lost a great deal of blood, while simultaneously coming to grips with the fact that their son and brother John had been slain, and preparing for another imminent Cheyenne attack. As all of this unfolded, one of the women, who remains unnamed in historical accounts, cried out that a large band of horsemen were heading their way from the south, and that she believed them to be Cheyenne. And, for a few fleeting moments, all among them feared that they would soon be overrun by a large force of warriors. But it turned out that this was in fact a cavalry company heading to nearby Fort Harker. Meanwhile, word had spread through the nearby homesteads that Tall Bull and his dog soldiers had ravaged the area, and by late afternoon, several local ranchers had gathered at the cabin of Lon Schermerhorn to assemble a search party for the Cheyenne captives. But just before dusk, the men inside the cabin suddenly heard the cries of a panicked woman coming from the river. It was Bridget Kine, who had miraculously managed to escape by hiding under the riverbank and was now making her way towards the cabin, still clutching her child to her chest. The mother and child were cared for as the rescue party listened intently to her story and made plans for their mission the next day. The next morning, the rescue party headed out early. And later on the same morning, Eli Ziegler and John Alverson staggered into the camp of the Army's 7th Cavalry, located not far from Bullfoot Creek, a small tributary of the Saline River, having traveled all through the night after losing their wagon and surviving the Dog Soldiers' attack. They reported the Cheyenne attacks of the previous day to the commanding officer, Lieutenant Edward Law. But Law informed the two men that he had been charged with pursuing another band of Cheyenne who had been raiding in the area, and thus he could not divert his mission until he received official orders from his commanding officer at Fort Harker. Eli Ziegler, clearly aghast with the lieutenant's lack of action, described his feeling on the matter in his later account. Quote, "We reported to the officer what we had seen, and we told him what we had heard that night, out on the Saline River bottom, and of all the fire arrows we had seen just a little above the Bigfoot. I begged him to saddle up at once, to furnish me a horse, and I would lead them right to the Indians' camp, where I thought we could catch them if we moved at once and moved quickly. He replied, 'I cannot move any further until I get orders to do so. The Indians were in the settlements over the river yesterday afternoon, but I do not know how much damage they could have done.' He said that he had sent a dispatch to Fort Harker for orders and that he would wait until he received an answer. We were disgusted with his reply. We drank a cup of coffee, ate a hardtack, and started back home, keeping on the south side of the river." End quote. As Ziegler and Alverson made their way back home, dejected and dreading what they would find upon their return, the search party that had gathered at Schermerhorn's ranch had made their way to the site of Haley's cabin, in a wagon which they intended to use to carry the dead back for burial. Following the trail of gore that stretched along the river, they were greeted with the sight of utter devastation that they had expected to find. Bodies lie strewn about the ground, seemingly all of them still in death. First, they came upon the body of John Strange. The unfortunate young man was placed into the wagon in order to be returned to his family. They then came upon the bodies of Erskild and Stein Lauritsen, the Danish immigrant couple who had been shot and killed while on their peaceful Sunday stroll. With no family to be returned to, they were buried where they had fallen. Next, the bodies of George Weichel and Fred Meigerhoff were found, and also buried where they had fallen. But, incredibly, they found 4-year-old Willis Alderdice was actually still alive. The search party then immediately sent out a messenger, one J.J. Pete, to the camp of the 7th Cavalry to request help from the camp surgeon. But, unbelievably and inexplicably, the camp surgeon, whose name has been lost to history, refused to treat Willis Alderdice's wounds. In his recounting of his dealings with the camp surgeon, Pete angrily recalled that, quote, "I have met many Army officers and found them to be honorable men and grand comrades. This one was in the shape of a man, but it ended there." End quote. But despite the cowardly, callous nature of the surgeon, Willis Alderdice actually managed to survive, and even endured the extraction of one of the arrows in a harrowing ordeal carried out by 2 of the local men tending to him. As all of this unfolded, Thomas Alderdice and John Strange, the patriarchs of the Alderdice and Strange families, were on their way back to their homesteads after completing their business trip in Junction City, Kansas. They had been totally unaware of the events that had taken place until a rider sent out from the party assembled at the Schermerhorn Ranch had come to meet them. The rider had informed them of the attack, and they had all raced back to the settlements. Upon arriving back, they were ushered to the home of Marshall Hendrickson, a cousin to the Strange family. Here, it was Henderson who was given the unenviable task of informing Thomas Alderdice and John Strange of exactly what had unfolded. Recounting the events many years later, Hendrickson recalled that he could only muster up a brutally honest explanation of the situation to the 2 men. "Strange," he said, "your boy is killed. Alderdice, your family is all killed or captured." Strange was taken to view the body of his unfortunate son, while Alderdice was taken to be with his stepson Willis, before himself viewing the bodies of his deceased son Frank and stepson John. As the young Willis Alderdice, still in great pain, lie recovering inside the Hendrickson cabin, Thomas Alderdice attended to the funeral of John and Frank. Alderdice had spent the previous evening both attending to Willis and assisting in building the coffins, but once the funeral was complete, he had taken to the trail of the Cheyenne, intent on saving his wife and his remaining child. He had served as a scout under Colonel Forsyth with the U.S. Army, who had combated the Cheyenne years before, and now, seeing the attitude of the local military, he decided that his only real chance of finding his family would be to do it himself. On June 1st, 2 days after Tall Bull and his warriors had attacked his family, Thomas Alderdice ventured out onto the plains in search of his wife, his child, and the Cheyenne. In his own account of his travels, written 3 weeks later on June 21st, Alderdice, showing his expertise as an experienced scout, meticulously recounted the direction and the mileage of his route as he attempted to find the Cheyenne. Quoting from his journals, "I traveled from the Saline River 3 miles east of Spillman Creek, then headed north by northwest, striking the north branch of Salt Creek, distance 12 miles. Then I traveled west by north, up the north branch of the Salt Creek, before striking Spillman Creek about a half a mile above the main fork, distance 9 miles. Traveled up West Fork of Spillman to head of creek, traveling west by northwest, then crossed to Wolf Creek, striking the East Fork, then went up East Fork about 4 miles, crossed to West Fork." End quote. After this arduous trek, Alderdice finally located the Cheyenne Trail. He followed this north until he spotted 3 Cheyenne who were out hunting. Again, quoting from Alderdice's account, "I supposed a large camp above, and secreted myself in a ravine to watch their movements. I could see nothing but Indians going out and returning to the creek. I returned back to the settlement for help." Alderdice had then made the equally arduous trip to return to the settlement, one that took him several days to complete. But to his dismay, by the time he returned, Lieutenant Law and the 7th Cavalry had moved out of the area. This was a devastating blow, as Alderdice had been counting on requesting immediate military assistance and knew that time was of the essence. But he remained undaunted, leaving the settlement for Fort Harker, where he was certain he would be able to find immediate assistance. He arrived on June 19th, now a full 18 days after the killing and capture of his children and wife, and he requested a meeting with the commander of the U.S. Department of the Missouri, General John Schofield. But here, too, Alderdice was left disappointed, as he was outright denied any meeting with the commanding officer. However, he was able to secure a brief meeting with one General George Armstrong Custer, who listened intently to Alderdice's horrifying story before assuring the distraught husband and father that he would present his story directly to his commanding officers. Still, Custer warned him that he did not know if it would produce any effect. But in a fortuitous turn for Alderdice, a local newspaper, the Leavenworth Daily Commercial, would run a story on his plight the following day, conveying not only a profound sympathy for his heart-wrenching situation, but a profound disgust with the conduct of the military officials who had denied to help him. The article noted that there are times when what is known as red tape may be excusable in military as it is in other matters. There are times, however, when its observance in military matters is likely to prove productive of a great wrong. A case in point was reported to us yesterday. A gentleman whose wife and youngest child, together with a young Swede girl, had been captured by Indians, and whose other child had been killed, arrived in this city Friday afternoon for the purpose of securing military aid. The gentleman, terribly grieved at his loss and at the threatened and probable fate of the captured, would not rest until he made an effort to have done all that was possible for their relief. But he was refused an audience until about 9 o'clock the following morning. The distress of the gentleman in question at his failure to get an audience and an order for troops was very great. With 2 helpless women in the hands of these red devils, the one a wife with a young child, who will wonder that the man was nearly distracted on being refused an audience on Friday afternoon? This level of bad press led to General Schofield finally granting a meeting to Alderdice on June 21st. But ultimately, the meeting was to little effect, with Alderdice only able to leave a written description of his wife and child with Schofield. For his part, the general contended that the Cheyenne had almost certainly already left the area, and it would be a risky move for him to expend an entire company in search of native forces who were no longer there. Schofield offered that he could send a telegram to the commander of nearby Fort Supply, head of the Department of the Platte, General C.C. Augur. But for the time being, Schofield told Alderdice that this was all that he could do. And so, Alderdice had again left the gates of a frontier fort, dejected and nearly overwhelmed with equal parts fear and grief, which seemed to alternately wash over him as he made his way back to the Cheyenne camp. When he arrived back at the location of the camp, General Schofield's presumption that the Cheyenne had left the area was proven correct, as all that Alderdice found were the remains of the camp. Still, he took the opportunity to sift through its remains, hoping to find any kind of clue that might lead him to his captured loved ones. As he moved from one circle of flattened prairie grass to another, each one the former site of a Cheyenne lodge, he finally assumed that there was nothing to be found. Then, just as he was about to give up his search, he noticed something hanging from the branches of a nearby tree. Walking over to the tree, he finally realized that what he saw was his missing daughter, who had been dispatched by the Cheyenne and left in the tree. Sick with grief, Alderdice had dug a grave in the hard prairie ground and laid her to rest, all while keeping a watchful eye out for any lingering Cheyenne warriors. For Thomas Alderdice, it now seemed that all hope was lost. But back at Fort Supply, General Augur had received the telegram informing him of Alderdice's plight and had sent a courier out to inform Major General Eugene Carr that he should immediately take to the trail of the Cheyenne and attempt to recover the missing captives. Carr was already out on the plains, and when he received the message, he had quickly assembled his men and his Pawnee scouts and moved out in search of the Cheyenne's trail. Among his scouts, most of whom were Pawnee, is one William F. Cody, otherwise known as Buffalo Bill, a legendary frontiersman and one of the most skilled scouts and trackers in the entirety of the U.S. Army. On July 11th, nearly 6 weeks after the Cheyenne had taken the Alderdice family, Carr and his men finally located the Cheyenne camp and made their attack about noon. This attack would take Tall Bull and the rest of the village completely by surprise, utterly devastating the unsuspecting Cheyenne. Seeing no hope of defending themselves from the center of the village, Tall Bull and several of the other dog soldiers had moved their families into this small ravine, where he and Wolf with Plenty of Hair now stand, ready to fight to the death. Now, Major General Carr, Buffalo Bill Cody, and the rest of the men slam into the Cheyenne lines, first cutting down the young Wolf with Plenty of Hair where he stands. Then, a vicious close-quarters fight unfolds, all while Thomas Alderdice desperately searches the village for his missing wife, Susanna. This terrible scene, known to history as the Battle of Summit Springs, will go on to be one of the most ruthless, vicious battles in the history of the Old West. In Part 2 of this episode, we will see the death of Tall Bull, the debate over who killed him, the ultimate fate of Susanna Alderdice, and how Buffalo Bill Cody would eventually bring this story to stages around the world in his Wild West shows. But for tonight, the many tales surrounding the terrible history of the Battle of Summit Springs are other stories for other times. Thank you for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. Be sure to click the like button, share this episode with a friend, and become a subscriber. Also, if you'd like to support our work and gain early access to episodes as well as ad-free viewing and all that good stuff, you can become a member of this channel by clicking on the subscribe button down below. Also, down below, you will find links to our TikTok, our Instagram, and our daily newsletter. Subscribe to any of them or all of them. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.